Amos Crake had kept Fenmoor Hall standing for 50 years. 50 years of tapping stone and listening for water. And on the morning the London engineer arrived, that man ordered Amos's tools thrown into the flooded cellar and never once looked up from his drawings. Amos did not argue. He knelt in the black mud at the cellar mouth. He lifted his grandfather's brass plumb-bob out of the muck, wiped it clean against his coat, and walked home in silence. That afternoon, on the terrace, before 40 invited gentlefolk in their fine coats and feathered hats, the engineer, Mr. Julian Vance, raised his voice for all to hear. "The man cannot even sign his own name," he said. "He'll hardly tell me how to hold up a house." And they laughed. They all laughed. The sound of it carried out over the lawns and the fen beyond. But Amos knew a thing that no London drawing could ever show. He knew why the great house was truly sinking. He knew what his own forefathers had buried beneath it 300 years before, and why. He knew the one thing that would either save Fenmoor Hall or watch it drown standing up, and not a soul on that terrace thought to ask him. If you believe respect is earned in silence, then this story is for you. Before we go on, if stories like this one move you, take a moment now to subscribe and tell me in the comments which town you're watching from tonight. I truly want to see how far this story travels. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. Fenmoor Hall stood near Marish Fen, in the low country of Lincolnshire, in the autumn of the year 1875. It was a great old house of pale stone. It had a long face of tall windows and chimneys like a row of grey soldiers, and a roof that dipped and rose against the wide flat sky. Around it lay the water meadows and the dykes and the black peat fields, all sitting scarcely a hand's breadth above the level of the drains. This was drowned country, country that men had wrung out of the marsh with spade and prayer, and in the middle of it all, the hall had stood for 300 years and never once shifted. 10 generations of Crakes had tended those walls. Amos knew this the way he knew his own 2 hands. His father had tended them, his father's father. Back and back, further than the parish books ran, into a time before anyone thought to write a labouring man's name down at all. Every Crake had learnt the same craft at his father's knee: how to read a wall by the sweat on it, how to lay a hand flat on cold stone and feel, through the skin, whether the house was easy or whether the house was troubled. Amos was near 70 now. He was a broad, slow man, thick through the shoulders, with hands that had gone hard as the stone they worked. His hair had gone the colour of ash. His face was plain and weathered and gave little away. He could not read a word, not the Bible, not his own name, not the grand papers the gentry passed between them, but he could walk the cellars of Fenmoor in the dark with his eyes shut, and tell you by the smell of the air and the sound of the drip where the water sat that morning and where it had sat the morning before. He rose before light most days. He would go down into the great vaulted cellars with a lantern and a length of chalk. He would tap along the old walls with a small iron hammer, his ear cocked, listening, tap and listen. Tap and listen. A sound man knew what he was hearing. To Amos it was as plain as speech. A dead, flat knock meant soundstone with sound work behind it. A hollow ring, a long, shivering note, meant trouble come creeping, and a wet, sucking silence, low down where the floor met the footings, meant the water had shifted, and the house wanted seeing to. His grandson went with him most mornings. Ned Crake, 16 years old, dark-haired, quick-eyed, all elbows and eagerness. Ned had been to the parish school. Ned could read and write a fair hand, and cipher his sums, and this was the great pride and the great puzzle of the family both at once. For the boy had letters, and the old man had none, and yet it was the old man who knew everything, and the boy who knew nothing that mattered here. Ned understood this, in the way a good boy understands his grandfather is a kind of king. He would hold the lantern high and watch Amos's face in the dark, and try to hear what the old man heard. There, Amos said one grey morning, low down against the north wall. He had his palm flat on the stone. Feel that, boy, Ned crouched and pressed his own hand where the old man's had been. "It's cold," he said. "It's wet." "Aye, but how wet?" Amos moved the boy's hand along, slow, there and there. "She's drawn up an inch since Lady Day. She's drinking well, she's easy." He said it the way another man might speak of a horse that had eaten its feed. "A house like this, she floats, Ned, remember that. She don't sit on the ground like a cottage sits. She floats. And a thing that floats has got to have her water under her, or she's nothing. You hear me?" "I hear you, Grandad. You don't yet." Amos stood, his knees cracking in the cold. "But you will. There's time." There was less time than either of them knew. The house belonged now to a young widow. Lady Marianne Fenmoor, 28 years old, not 2 years married, and already left alone. Her husband had been Sir Edmund, the last of the old line, a decent, quiet man who had loved this house the way his fathers loved it, and Sir Edmund had loved old Amos too, in the plain way of it. He had trusted the mason above any man on the estate. Whatever Crake says of the walls, he would tell his steward, "You do. Never mind that he can't read you a reason. He's right, and the reason don't signify." Sir Edmund had understood something the clever men would forget, that a thing can be true whether or not a man can write it down. But Sir Edmund was 3 years dead of a fever caught out on the winter fen, and his widow was left with the house, the land, the tenants, the drains, the servants, and a debt that would have curled a stronger person's hair. For the old baronet, God rest him, had borrowed heavily against the estate in his last years to drain new ground and raise new banks, and the whole of Fenmoor now stood mortgaged to the Cawood and Sedge Bank of Lincoln. The interest fell due like clockwork. The principal loomed behind it like a storm out on the North Sea, coming slow, but coming. Lady Marianne was not a foolish woman. But she was young, and she was frightened, and she was alone, and she had been raised to believe that the men who mattered were the men with letters after their names and offices in London. She loved the Hall with her whole heart. It had been her husband's, and now it was all she had left of him. The thought of losing it to the bank kept her awake through the long fen nights, listening to the wind come off the marsh. And that autumn, the house began, very slightly, to sink. It was small at first. A door in the west wing that had always closed sweet began to bind at the top. A crack, thin as a hair, opened along a plaster cornice in the morning room. The great flagstones of the hall floor, laid flat for 300 years, showed the faintest tilt, so a dropped marble would roll, slow, toward the western wall. Nothing a country house does not do in its old age, but to a frightened young widow with a bank at her back, it looked like the beginning of the end. Amos had seen it too, of course. He had seen it before anyone. But he was not troubled by it the way the household was troubled. "She's settling to the wet season," he told the steward, Mr. Pruitt, one morning in the yard, "same as she does every back end of the year. Come the spring floods she'll take up her water and rise true again. She always has. Leave her be. Keep the old drains clear, same as ever, and she'll do." Mr. Silas Pruitt was the estate steward, a thin, careful, anxious man of 50, forever in a good black coat, forever with an eye on how a thing would look. He had come to the estate from a town office. He did not love the fen, and the fen did not love him. And, more than anything in this world, Silas Pruitt wanted to appear modern and capable before her young ladyship. He wanted her to see that the estate was in clever, up-to-date hands, and an old illiterate mason telling him to keep the ditches clear and trust to the spring was not, to Mr. Pruitt's mind, a modern answer at all. "Take up her water," Pruitt repeated. He said it the way a man repeats a child's nonsense. "Rise true again." "Crake, the house is going down. Anyone with eyes can see it going down. And your remedy is that we should do nothing, and wait for a flood?" "My remedy," Amos said slowly, is that we do what's been done here 300 year, which is nothing but keep her fed and let her be. Yes, well, Pruitt drew his coat about him. I think her ladyship would be better served by an opinion that can be set down on paper. So Pruitt wrote to London, and in due course London came to Fenmoor. They arrived on a bright cold morning in a hired carriage from the station, 2 gentlemen and their instruments, and the whole yard turned out to see them. Vance and Harlow, the firm was called, of Great George Street, in Westminster, hard by the great works of Parliament itself. Consulting engineers. The very newest thing, Mr. Julian Vance was the lead man, and the younger partner, a tall, handsome, well-made gentleman of perhaps 35, dressed beautifully, moving easily, with a smooth, confident voice that filled a room without ever seeming to rise. He shook Lady Marianne's hand and bowed over it, and told her within 2 minutes that her difficulties were entirely common, entirely soluble, and entirely within his firm's long experience. And Lady Marianne, who had been so frightened for so long, felt something in her chest come loose with relief. Here at last was a man who knew. His fee, set down neat in the agreement Pruitt laid before her, was 800 guineas. It was a staggering sum. It was near a year of the estate's whole income, but Vance spoke of it lightly, as the natural cost of doing a thing properly, and against the terror of losing the Hall entire, 800 guineas seemed to her ladyship a price worth any pain. She signed. Pruitt beamed. The thing was done. Mr. Vance walked the house that first day with a footman carrying his case, and Pruitt at his heels, and he talked as he walked. He talked of subsidence and of substrata. He talked of the load-bearing and the settlement, and the want of a proper deep footing. He had a way of naming a thing in long Latin words that made the countrymen feel they had never truly seen their own house before. He tapped the walls with a silver-headed cane, though not, Amos noticed, the way a mason taps. He tapped the way a man knocks on a door. He was not listening. He was only making a sound. Amos followed at a distance through the cellars, saying nothing, his cap in his 2 hands. He waited for the engineer to lay a palm on the stone. He waited for him to grow quiet and cock his head at the sound of the water. But Vance did none of it. Vance took out a little brass instrument and squinted through it and wrote figures in a book. He measured the crack in the morning-room cornice with a rule and wrote that down too. He never once stood still long enough to feel the house breathe. At last, in the great cellar, with the lantern light throwing their shadows huge against the old vaults, Amos could hold his tongue no longer. He stepped forward. He turned his cap in his hands. "Begging your pardon, sir," he said. "Might I say a word about the water?" Vance looked round at him, mildly, as one looks at a piece of furniture that has spoken. "The water," he said. "Yes, the water is precisely the trouble, my man. The cellars are half drowned. You've a foot of standing water down here in the low bays. That is your subsidence in a sentence. The ground is waterlogged, it has no bearing, and the house is sinking into a bog. The first work is to get the water out, drain it, dry the ground, and give the footing something firm to stand upon." "No, sir." Amos said it quiet, but he said it plain. "That's the very thing you mustn't do." The cellar went still. Pruitt drew a sharp breath. "The hall floats, sir," Amos went on. "She always has. She's built to. She sits on a great raft of old oak down under this floor, laid 300 year ago by men that knew this fen. And that oak wants to stay wet. Wet oak is hard as iron and lasts 1,000 year. Dry oak rots. If you draw off her water, sir, if you pump these cellars dry, that raft will dry, and rot, and he searched for it, she'll drown standing up. That's the only way I know to say it to you. Keep her wet and she stands. Dry her out to keep her dry, and you'll kill her." There was a silence, and then Mr. Julian Vance laughed. It was a small, kind, patient laugh, and it was worse than a shout. "A raft," he said, "of oak, and it wants to stay wet." He turned to Pruitt, and his voice took on a note of gentle wonder, as if he had found something charming. "Do you know, Mr. Pruitt, one hears these things in the country, and one hardly credits them. The house floats. The wood must drink. It's a kind of poetry, isn't it? Fen superstition. The very oldest sort." He turned back to Amos, and he spoke to him slowly and clearly, the way one speaks to the deaf or the simple. "My good man, water in a foundation is the enemy of a foundation. That is not an opinion. That is the first principle of my science. We shall pump this cellar dry, we shall drive iron piles down to firm bearing, and we shall make this house as sound as the Bank of England. Now, I'm sure there is work for you in the gardens." Amos looked at him a long moment. Then he looked at Pruitt, who would not meet his eye. Then he put his cap back on his head, and turned, and went up the stone stair into the light. It was that same day, in the tool-room off the yard, that Ned found his grandfather standing over the old plumb-bob, turning it slow in his fingers. It was a beautiful old thing, a weight of solid brass, gone dark gold with age and handling, shaped like a long teardrop, heavy and true. It hung on a length of waxed-line wound round a worn wooden reel. Every mason had his plumb-bob. It was the tool that told you what was truly upright in a crooked world, the one honest line a builder had. But this one was older than any Amos had ever seen in another man's hand. It had come down to him from his grandfather, and to that grandfather from further back still, none knew how far. And on one flat of the brass, worn but clear if you knew to look, there was cut a small mark, a maker's mark, a mason's mark, 2 crossed tools within a circle, and a letter that might have been a C. All of it made small and neat by a careful hand long turned to dust. "That's his mark, is it, Grandad?" Ned asked. He had asked it before. He liked the answer. "It's the mark of the man that made her," Amos said. "And his mark's on more than this, boy, if you knew where to look. A mason cuts his mark on his own work, so as another mason coming after knows whose hand it was. That's how we sign, you see." He said it without bitterness, but Ned heard the shape of the day in it. Cannot even sign his own name. That's how our sort has always signed, not with letters, with the work itself. He wound the line back onto the reel and put the plumb-bob in his coat, over his heart, where he carried it. "That London man," Ned began carefully. "He's going to pump the cellars, Grandad. Pruitt's ordered the pump." "I know it. And you said—" The boy stopped. "You said it'd kill her." "I said it." Amos sat down heavy on the bench. He looked suddenly very old to the boy. "And I'll say it once more, to her ladyship if she'll hear me, and then I'll say it no more, for a man that says a true thing 3 times to folk that won't hear it is only a fool shouting at the tide." He looked at his grandson. "You mark what you see this winter, Ned. You've got your letters. One day it may fall to you to say what I can't get said. Watch it all. Remember it all. Will you do that?" "I will, Grandad." The boy did not fully understand, but he swore it as though he did. The great steam pump came the following week on a low wagon drawn by 4 horses, and it changed the whole feel of the place. It was a black iron thing, squat and hissing, and they set it up beside the cellar steps and ran a fat leather hose down into the dark. When they lit its fire and set it going, it made a sound that never stopped. A slow, heavy thump and gasp, like a great sick heart, day and night, day and night. And out of the hose, hour after hour, gushed the black water of the cellars, sluicing away down a cut into the dike, running the old drowned bays dry for the first time in 300 years. Amos was barred from the works now. Vance had made it a condition, politely, that the local men not interfere with the operations, and Pruitt had been glad enough to enforce it. So the old mason kept away. But he could not keep his mind away. He would stand at the edge of the yard in the evening and listen to that pump thump and gasp in the dark, and Ned, watching him, saw his grandfather's jaw work and knew the old man was counting. Counting how much water was going out, counting how long the oak had left before the air got to it. The iron piles came next. Vance's men set up a heavy frame over holes cut through the cellar floor, and a great weight that they hauled up on a chain and let fall, over and over, driving lengths of iron pipe down into the fen. The blows of it ran through the whole house. You felt them in the walls. You felt them in your teeth at the supper table. Bang, and a pause. Bang, and a pause. "Each one," Amos said quietly to the boy, "each one a nail in her." For the iron went down cold and hard through the very raft the old men had laid, splitting the oak, letting the water in where it shouldn't come and driving it out where it should stay. And the house began, in earnest now, to answer. The thin crack in the morning-room cornice was no longer thin. It ran now, a black seam, up the plaster and across the ceiling, and a piece the size of a dinner plate came down one night and shattered on the floor. In the great ballroom, where no crack had ever been in living memory, fine lines began to spider out from the tall window reveals, climbing the walls like frost climbing a pane. The binding door in the west wing would no longer close at all. The tilt in the hall floor, that had been a thing you needed a marble to see, was a thing you could feel now under your own 2 feet as you walked, a slow, sickening lean toward the west. Lady Marianne walked her house in those weeks with a growing terror behind her calm face. She had signed for 800 guineas to save her home, and her home was falling faster than it had ever fallen before. She said as much carefully to Mr. Vance, and Mr. Vance had an answer ready, smooth as glass. This was to be expected, he told her. This was the house releasing its old strains as the new footings took up the load. It would grow worse before it grew better. It always did. She must not be alarmed by the very evidence of the work succeeding. And Lady Marianne, who wanted so badly to believe him, and who had no other rope to hold, held to that one, and told herself the cracking was the sound of healing. Only Amos knew it was the sound of dying, and no one would let Amos speak. But Amos had one thing left to do, and he did it quietly, and not for the household, and not for Vance, and not even for himself. He did it for the boy. So that one day someone who had letters would be able to say what he had seen with his own eyes. He waited for a still evening when the pump crew had gone up to the servants' hall for their supper, and he took Ned by the sleeve and led him round the back way, down a coal hole they'd not thought to bar, into the drained cellars. It was a strange, terrible sight down there now. The great vaulted bays that had been half under black water all of Ned's life stood dry. The floor a floor of cracked grey mud, drying and curling like an old scar. The air, that had always been thick and wet and cold, was going stale. And in the deepest bay, where Vance's men had cut a great square hole through the mud floor to sink their iron, the boy saw for the first time the thing his grandfather had spoken of. The raft. There, exposed in the pit, black and vast and old beyond reckoning, lay the ends of great oak timbers. Balks of oak thick as a man's body, laid crossways in a grid, going away into the dark under the whole house. This was the raft. This was what Fenmoor Hall had stood upon, floating on the wet fen, for 300 years. Amos climbed down into the pit with his lantern, and Ned came after, and the old man laid his bare hand flat against the great black timber, the way he laid his hand on the walls of a morning. But his face, in the lantern light, went stricken. "Feel it," he said, and his voice was not steady now. "Go on, boy, feel her." Ned put his hand where his grandfather's had been. He had expected cold. He had expected wet. But the great oak beam was not cold, and it was not wet. It was going dry. It was drying, out here in the stale air, going grey along its top edge, and when Ned pressed his fingers into a seam of it, a little crumb of the surface came away, soft under his nail. Soft, rotting, 300 years hard as iron in the black water, and 3 weeks of Vance's pump had begun to turn it to punk and powder. "That's her heart," Amos whispered. "That's what holds up every stone over our heads. And they've killed it. 3 weeks, and they've killed what 300 years couldn't touch." He was quiet a moment. Then he lifted his lantern higher and moved it along the pit wall to where the cut had gone down past the raft to the very bottom of things, to the ancient bedding stones the old builders had laid, first of all, deepest of all, the foundation of the foundation. "Now," he said. "Now here's the thing I want your eyes on, Ned, your reading eyes. Come here to me." He held the lantern close against the oldest, deepest, biggest of the bedding stones, a great squared block half sunk in the fen below the raft. And there, cut into its face, worn near smooth by 3 centuries of dark water, but there, unmistakably there when the raking light of the lantern caught it, was a mark. 2 crossed tools within a circle. And a letter that might have been a C. Ned's breath stopped in his chest. He took the plumb-bob from his grandfather's coat with a hand that shook, and he held it down beside the stone into the pool of lantern light, the small dark gold brass beside the great grey block. And the mark on the little weight and the mark on the vast stone were the same mark. The very same. The same crossed tools. The same circle. The same worn, patient C. The hand that had cut the mark on the plumb-bob 300 years ago, and the hand that had cut the mark on the very foundation stone of Fenmoor Hall 300 years ago, were one hand. "Grandad," Ned said. It came out as barely a sound at all. "Grandad, it's the same. It's the same mark. The man that made your plumb-bob," "Hush now," Amos said softly, but he was looking at the 2 marks in the light, and something moved behind his weathered face, something old and deep, and not quite grief. "Hush. I don't know all of it, boy. My father showed me this stone once, when I was younger than you, and told me to keep it to myself, and I never rightly knew the whole of what it meant." "There's papers," he said. "Somewhere in the house," he said. "There's papers that tell it." "But I can't read papers, Ned." He turned and looked at his grandson, and his eyes in the lantern light were bright. "But you can. You can read them, if they're to be found." And far above their heads, through 300 years of stone, the great sick pump went thump, and gasp, and thump, and gasp, emptying the house of the very water that had kept it standing since before the Crakes could write their name, and no one in all that grand and frightened household knew that down in the drying dark, an old man and a boy had just found the first thread of a secret that would, before the winter was out, bring the fashionable gentlemen of Great George Street to their public and lasting shame. But that reckoning was a long way off yet. For now there was only the pump in the dark, and the dry rot creeping through the great oak heart of the house, and the cracks climbing the ballroom walls, and a young widow lying awake with a bank at her back, believing the men who were killing her home. And there was a boy with letters climbing back up through the coal hole into the cold night. His grandfather's plumb-bob warm against his own heart now, turning one thought over and over in his quick young mind, like a key he did not yet know the lock for. Papers. Somewhere in the house there were papers. And Ned Crake could read. The muniment room lay at the cold end of the east wing, past the chapel, behind a door that had not been oiled in Ned's lifetime. He went at night, when the household slept, and the pump thumped on below like a bad heart. He carried a stub of candle and his grandfather's plumb-bob in his coat, and he told no one but Amos where he was. The room was full of the estate's paper memory. Rent rolls, tithe maps, bundles of deeds tied in pink tape gone brown. The smell was dust and old ink and mouse. Ned worked through it the way his grandfather worked stone, patient and slow, one shelf a night. He could read, and reading in that room was like listening to the dead talk. For a week he found nothing that mattered. Leases, a quarrel over a mill weir, settled in 1740. a list of servants long in their graves. His eyes ached by the candle, his feet went numb on the boards, and below him, always, the pump. Then, on the 9th night, wedged behind a japanned box of Sir Edmund's shooting accounts, he found a roll of vellum so old the sheep it came from had been dead 300 years. He knew it was different before he untied it. The tape was not tape but leather, cracked to the touch. The seal was wax gone the colour of dried blood, and when he spread it flat under the candle, the hand upon it was not the round clerk's hand of the rent rolls. It was crabbed and black and strange, the long letters leaning like reeds in a wind, and it took him the better part of an hour to make the first lines yield. But they yielded. It was an indenture. A building agreement, made in the 3rd year of Elizabeth, between the Fenmoor of that day and a master mason brought up out of the Fen country to raise a great house on drowned ground. And the mason's name, written plain 3 times in that black leaning hand, was Crake. Ned stopped breathing. He read it twice more to be sure his want had not put the word there. It had not. Crake, master mason. Crake, who covenanted to build the hall upon a raft of oak, and to bed her true, and here the boy's finger shook on the vellum, to keep her, he and his heirs after him, so long as Crake blood should run in the parish, to feed her water, to keep the timbers drowned. It named the leats by their old names. It named the sub-crypt. It set down, in words no London gentleman had read in 3 centuries, exactly what Amos had known only as a saying handed mouth to mouth from father to son, worn smooth as a river stone. The Crakes had not merely tended Fenmoor Hall. The Crakes had built her, and been made her keepers forever, before the first Fenmoor ever hung a portrait on her walls. Ned rolled the vellum with hands he could not steady, and he went down through the sleeping-house to find his grandfather, and he did not feel the cold at all. He found Amos in the coal-hole at 2 in the morning, as they had agreed, waiting with a lantern hooded to a slit. The old man was up to his knees in the black water of the sub-crypt, and he had been at work. Ned had seen the work grow over the past nights, and had helped where his young back could help, and still it frightened him a little, the size of what they were doing in the dark while the great firm slept, for they were feeding the house. Amos had found, by memory and by touch, the old clay-packed channels his fathers called the leats, the medieval drains run backward, made not to carry water off, but to bring it in and hold it. Vance had never looked for them. Vance had a drawing, and the leats were on no drawing. Amos had opened them one by one with a mason's bar and his bare hands, breaking the packed clay of ages. And the fen had answered. Slow, brown, patient water had come creeping back into the sub-crypt that the steam pump laboured all day to empty. And where the great oak raft had gone grey and soft and begun to stink of rot, the water was already darkening it again, swelling it, drawing it back toward life. "Grandfather," Ned said, and his voice cracked on it. "Grandfather, I found the papers." Amos straightened in the water. In the lantern's slit his old face was streaked with clay and fen mud, and his eyes came up to the boys. "Read me," he said. And Ned read him the indenture, there in the drowned dark, standing on the coal-hole steps, with the roll trembling in his hands, and the pump thumping far off and useless above them. He read the black leaning letters. He read the name. He read the covenant, that a Crake had raised these walls and a Crake should keep them wet forever, and when he came to the part where the mason set his own mark to the deed, 2 crossed tools within a circle, and a letter C, the boy looked up. "It's your mark," he whispered. "The plumb-bob. The stone. It's his. He's ours." For a long moment the old man said nothing. The water lapped at his knees. Somewhere a drip fell, and fell, and fell. Then Amos Crake put out one clay-black hand and laid it flat against the nearest oak pile, the wet, swelling ancient timber his own blood had driven into the fen 300 years before he was born, and he bowed his head over it the way a man bows over a grave, or a cradle. "So that's the whole of it," he said, very low. "That's what my father couldn't tell me, not knowing his letters neither. Only that we kept her, and mustn't say why, and mustn't ever let them dry her. He lifted his head. We built her, Ned. Our people built her. And these grand men come up from London to save her, and the saving of her is the killing of her, and they'll not hear it from a man that can't sign his name. He reached into the water at his belt and drew out something, and pressed it, cold and wet, into Ned's free hand. It was the brass plumb-bob. The mark was up. Even by the lantern's slit the boy could see it, worn but sure. "You keep that now," Amos said. "Whatever comes. You keep it, and you keep her. You can read the deed." I never could. He closed the boy's fingers over the brass with his own 2 hands, and there in the dark it was done, the thing that had passed 10 generations from father to son, passing once again, from the old keeper to the young. "You're the keeper after me. Say it." "I'm the keeper after you," Ned said. "Good lad." The old man turned back to his water and his rotted pile, and to the oak he was packing new. Good oak he had cut and shaped himself, bedded with charcoal against the rot and sealed round with the grey fen clay, exactly as the deed set down, and as his fathers had done at the dark of every moon for 300 years. "Now hold the light. We've the moon's work yet, and not many nights to do it in." They had, in truth, not many nights, for above them, in the reading world, the calendar was running down toward Michaelmas, and Michaelmas would bring the survey. The Cawood and Sedge Bank of Lincoln held the mortgage on Fenmoor Hall, 800 guineas of engineers' work notwithstanding, and the bank did not care for engineers. The bank cared for its money, and its money would not sit under a roof its own surveyor called unsound. Word had come by post, in the flat, courteous voice of men who foreclose. At Michaelmas the bank would send its man to survey the hall, and if he found her sinking past saving, he would condemn her and call the mortgage, and Lady Marianne Fenmoor would go out of her husband's house with what she could carry in a trap. 40 days, the letter said. Then it was 30. The cracks in the ballroom climbed a hand's breadth higher, and the great mirror over the chimney cracked corner to corner in the night with a sound like a shot, and a housemaid gave notice, saying the house groaned at her. Vance came up from London and walked the rooms with Prowett at his heel, and told her ladyship, in his beautiful unworried voice, that the movement was the work's taking hold, that a house long neglected must complain a little as it was set right, that she must not be alarmed by fen superstition. And Marianne, 28 years old, and 3 years a widow and drowning in a debt her husband's fever had left her, believed him, because to believe the old mason was to believe her home was being murdered under her, and there was nothing at all she could do. Then it was 10 days, and on the 10th night Silas Pruitt saw the light. The steward could not sleep. He never could, these nights, with 800 guineas of his own decision groaning in the walls. He had gone to the window of his room above the stable court to look at nothing, and looking at nothing he had seen it, a lantern's small glow, hooded, moving low along the cellar range where no light should be, where the works were shut and the pump ran alone in the dark. He stood a long time watching it, and a cold thought grew in him, the thought of a frightened man who needs the fault to be another's. Sabotage. The old man. The old man they had barred, creeping back to spoil the works out of spite, to drown what the firm had drained, and there was the reason the house grew worse instead of better, not the firm's error, not Pruitt's own error in hiring them, but the malice of an illiterate mason who could not bear to be bettered. He did not go down. He was not a brave man. He went back to his bed and he lay awake, and he built his story, and in the morning he wrote to Vance in London, and Vance came up on the fast train, with his fashionable calm and his contempt, and the two of them made ready for the survey that would either crown the firm or damn it. Neither of them, in all their reading and their drawings, had the least idea what the light in the cellar was truly doing. For the raft was rising. Slowly, over the 10 nights and the ones before, the great oak heart of the house had drunk back its water and swelled and taken up, and the iron piles the firm had driven were being lifted with it. And the whole vast weight of Fenmoor Hall was settling, at last, back onto the true bed her builders had made for her. The audience of the fen, the moon and the water and the old man and the boy, knew the hall was being saved. The household, reading its cracks like a death sentence, knew only that she was dying. And that is the cruelty of it, that the very groaning the servants fled from was the groan of a hurt thing mending, the timbers coming home. It came to a head on survey eve, as such things do. They were all in the house that night, the whole grim party gathered for the morning's judgment. Lady Marianne, white and still in the drawing-room, Pruitt, sweating, Vance, immaculate. Come up to see his commission vindicated before the banksman, the bank's surveyor himself, a dry Lincoln man with a rule in his pocket and no interest in anything but weight and plumb. And down below, unknown to any of them, Amos Crake stood to his waist in the subcrypt water, finishing the last of his father's work, with Ned at the top of the coal hole steps, holding the light. The raft reseated at 11:15. It had been lifting true for nights, but that was the night it came home, the moment the whole 300-year oak raft, refloated and swollen and buoyant again, took the last of the house's weight off the false iron and settled dead level onto its ancient bed. And a house does not do that quietly. 3 years of sinking, of tilt and strain and wrenched stone, undid itself in one great movement, and Fenmoor Hall levelled herself with a sound. The sound was enormous. It began in the cellars as a deep grinding groan, the noise of a mountain turning over in its sleep, and it ran up through the walls into every room at once. The cracks in the ballroom did not widen, they closed, snapping shut with a report like a rank of muskets, plaster bursting off in sheets. The cracked mirror fell entire from the chimney and shattered on the hearth. Doors that had jammed for 3 years flew open. Somewhere a chimney shed a load of soot down into a grate with a roar. And to every soul in that reading, frightened house, waked and flung upright by the din, there was only one meaning possible. The hall was coming down. They met on the great staircase, half-dressed, candles wild. Marianne with her hair down, one hand at her throat. Pruitt babbling. The Lincoln surveyor with his coat over his nightshirt, shouting that the house was unsafe, that they must get out, that he'd condemn her on the spot. And Vance who had been so calm, standing white now at the stairhead, because a man knows the difference between a house complaining and a house speaking, and this house had just spoken, and Julian Vance in his heart did not know what it had said. But he knew a man must never look afraid before the money. The old man, he said, it came out of him like the reflex it was. Pruitt's story, ready-made, dropped into the silence, and Vance seized it because he must have a cause that was not his own iron piles. The old man, he said again, louder, gathering, Crake, Pruitt saw his light in the cellars 10 nights running. He's been down there in the dark undoing the works, flooding what we drained, out of spite. Because we put him off. This is no subsidence. This is sabotage, my lady. The man has been drowning your house to ruin me, and by God he's near brought it down on all our heads. Fetch the constable, Pruitt cried, glad, so glad, to have the fault out of his own hands. Fetch the constable from Marish, the man's below now, I'll wager he'll be below. And he was below. They went down in a mob, the men of the party, Vance ahead with a lamp held high, and Pruitt at his shoulder and the surveyor after, down the cellar stair into the reek of wet oak and disturbed water, and there in the swinging lamplight they found him. Amos Crake, near 70 years old, standing to his waist in the black flood of the subcrypt, with his bare arms mud to the elbow, and his old face turned up to the light, caught red-handed at the very thing they had come to hang on him, the water come back, brimming where the firm had emptied it. "There," said Vance, and his beautiful voice shook with the relief of it. "There's your sinking, my lady. There's your saboteur. Take hold of him." Two of the grooms went down the steps into the water and took the old man by the arms, and Amos did not fight them. He never fought. He only stood and let them turn him, and as they wrenched him round toward the steps, his own inherited work was jostled, and something small and bright was struck from the ledge where Ned had set it for safety, and fell. It was the plumb-bob. Ned cried out, a boy's cry, high and horrified, and lunged for it, and missed, and the brass went down into the black water, with a small sound that no one but the boy heard under all the shouting, down into the dark and the cold and the churned mud where 300 years of crakecraft lay drowned. Gone, the mark, the proof, the passed-down heart of it, sunk in the flood on the very eve of the reckoning, and the old man went up the steps in the groom's hands and out, silent, condemned, to wait for the Marish constable and the morning that would take away everything. It was Lady Marianne who saved it. Not by faith, she had none left that night, but by the one hard, clever act of a drowning woman. She would not let them send for the constable before the survey. She was not, whatever else, a fool, and even in her terror one cold thread of sense held. If the hall was to be condemned in the morning, and her home lost, she would not also have hanged an old servant of her husband's on the word of the very men whose 800 guineas had, perhaps, done the ruin. She had heard the firm blame the mason too readily. She had lived 3 years among people who blamed the man beneath them. "No," she said, "no constable, not till it is known what has truly been done here." And then, because she had one card and would play it, I have sent for Sir Denholm Ash. He was my husband's friend, and he is the first engineer in England, and he owes this house a kindness, and he comes tonight. Nothing will be decided, nothing, Miss Vance, until a man I trust has been down these stairs. You may all wait upon Sir Denholm. Vance's calm face did a thing it had not done in the whole tale. It flickered, for Julian Vance knew the name of Sir Denholm Ash. Every engineer in the kingdom knew it, and a man does not flinch at the coming of a colleague unless, somewhere under his beautiful certainty, he has begun to fear what a better man might find. Sir Denholm Ash came in the last hour before dawn, a big, slow old man in a travelling coat, wet from the fen roads, and he would take neither food nor fire until he had seen the house. He listened at the stairhead, with his head cocked as a bird cocks its. He laid his broad hand flat on the ballroom wall where the cracks had snapped shut, and pressed, and was still a long moment. He said nothing to Vance's stream of sabotage and spite. He said only, "Show me the cellars," and he took a lamp, and he went down. He was below a long time. They waited above in the ruined ballroom, all of them, in the grey coming light, Marianne white as her own gown, Pruitt wringing his hands, Vance standing very straight, and saying, too often, that it was plainly the old man's mischief, and any competent man would see it. The Lincoln surveyor waited with his rule and his condemning paper. And Amos Crake sat in a corner under the eye of the grooms, mud drying on him, saying nothing, an old man who had lost the last proof of who he was to the black water below. When Sir Denholm came up the cellar stair at last, the lamp in his hand and his coat soaked to the thigh, the room went silent of itself. He set the lamp down. He looked at no one but Marianne. "My lady," he said, "who drained your cellars?" "The firm," she said faintly. "Mrs. Vance, to cure the sinking." "Ah!" He nodded slowly, the way a physician nods at a symptom that confirms the worst. "And who flooded them again?" "The old man is accused. Who flooded them again?" Sir Denholm said, and he turned now and looked at the muddy figure in the corner. "You, I think. Come here to me, if you please." Amos rose, and came, and stood before the great engineer with his cap gone, and his white hair wild, and his hands filthy, and did not lower his eyes. You opened the old drains, Sir Denholm said. The medieval leats. You brought the fen back into the subcrypt on purpose. You have been packing the piles, new oak, I saw, and charcoal and clay in the old manor. It was not a question. Why? And Amos Crake said, in his slow fen voice, the thing he had tried to say on the terrace before the 40 gentlefolk and been laughed at for saying, because she floats, sir. She's built on a raft of oak, 300-year-old, and oak under water is forever, but oak in the air is 3 weeks' rot. They drew off her water. I put it back. That's the whole of it. I've kept her wet 50 years, sir, and my father afore me, and his afore him, because that's the keeping of her. Draw her dry, and she drowns standing up. I told the gentleman so. He did not look at Vance. He'd not hear it. There was a silence you could have cut and served. Then Sir Denholm Ashe turned to the whole assembled room, to the surveyor and the steward and the immaculate London engineer, and he began, slowly, to detonate their world. This man, he said, is right, and every certified thing done to this house these 3 months has been wrong. He let that stand a moment. Vance opened his mouth. Sir Denholm went over him like the sea over a stone. Fenmoor Hall stands upon a floating foundation, a raft of oak balks, bedded in the fen, kept permanently below water. It is an ancient method. I have seen its like but twice in 40 years, once in the Low Countries and once in a Venetian church, and never in England so whole and so old. Under water oak does not rot. It grows nigh to iron, whole cities stand on it. But the timber must never, never be let to dry. The instant you expose it to the air, he lifted his wet hand toward the ceiling. The closed cracks. The whole groaning house, it rots, it softens, it fails, and the house upon it begins to sink. Which is precisely, sir, now he looked at Vance, and only at Vance, what your steam pump has been doing since midsummer. You did not cure the sinking. You caused it. You drained the very water that held this house up, and then you drove iron piles to hold up what your own draining was pulling down. And you charged this lady 800 guineas for the privilege of destroying her home. Julian Vance's fashionable calm did not shatter all at once. That is not how such men break. It cracked, hairline, the way the ballroom walls had cracked, a stiffening about the mouth, a whiteness. This is theory, he said. Fen superstition dressed in. It is not theory, Sir Denholm said. The house has just proved it herself. That great noise in the night that frightened you all half to death, that was not collapse. That was the raft taking up its water again and lifting true, and the whole house settling level for the first time in 3 years. Your cracks did not open in the night. Mr. Vance, go and look. They closed. A sinking house does not heal itself. A house set right upon its proper bed does exactly that, and screams once as it comes home. He turned back to Marianne. Your hall is not falling, my lady. She has just been caught. By him. Marianne Fenmoor put her hand over her mouth and made no sound at all. But Sir Denholm was not finished, and the second layer, when it came, was the one that turned the whole tale over. You call him saboteur, he said, a meddling old servant. Let me tell you what I found on the deepest bedding stone of your foundation, the stone this whole vast house rests its weight upon. He held up his own hand and traced in the air a shape. A mason's mark, 2 crossed tools within a circle, and a letter, C, cut by the man who built these foundations 300 years ago. And when I came up just now and looked, in passing, at this old fellow's tools, being a curious man, he stopped. He looked at Amos. You carried a plumb-bob, they tell me. An old brass one. Where is it? In the water, sir, Ned said, before he could stop himself. The boy had crept in at the edge of the room and could hold his tongue no longer. It fell in the water when they took him. His mark's on it. The same mark. I found it. I found the papers. Papers. said Sir Denholm Ashe, very quietly, and something in the big old man went still and alert. "What papers, boy?" And Ned Crake, 16 years old and shaking, came forward into the middle of that great company with the roll of vellum he had carried against his heart these 10 days, and he unrolled it on the ballroom floor in the grey dawn light, and Sir Denholm Ashe went down on one knee in his wet coat to read it. He read it a long time. His lips moved over the black leaning letters, and when he lifted his head, his weathered face had changed, and he read it aloud to the whole hushed room, the surveyor and the steward and the white-faced London engineer and the young widow and the old muddy mason standing over him. Read the indenture of the 3rd year of Elizabeth, made between the Fenmoor of that day and the master mason brought up out of the fen to build her. Great house on drowned ground. Crake, he read. Master mason. It is here 3 times. He covenants to build the hall upon a raft of oak and to bed her true. And more. Sir Denholm's voice went slow and deliberate so that not a word should be missed. He covenants that he and his heirs after him, so long as Crake blood runs in this parish, shall keep her, shall feed her water, and keep her timbers drowned, forever, perpetual keepers of the foundation of Fenmoor. Named in the deed. Bound by it. He rose to his feet, the old vellum in his hand, and he looked from the deed to the muddy, illiterate old man before him, and he did the thing that finished it. He inclined his head. To Amos. This man's family, Sir Denholm Ashe said, into the ringing silence, raised these walls before your grandfathers were born, and they alone, in 10 generations, have known how to keep them standing. You have had, my lady, at your gate all this while, for the wage of a servant, the heir of the men who built your house, and you sent to London and paid 800 guineas for men to come and undo his work. Now the faces broke, and Sir Denholm's tale gave each of them its own moment, and this is the part the fen still tells. Julian Vance broke first and quietest, which was the worst of all. There was no bluster left in it. The beautiful voice was simply gone. He looked at the deed, and at the old man, and at the closed cracks in the walls, and every certainty he had carried up from Great George Street drained out of his fashionable face and left it the face of a much smaller man, a man who had been wrong in front of everyone that mattered, and who would never in his life be quite so sure again. He said, I did not know. It was true, and it damned him. He had not known, because he had not troubled to learn, because the man who could have told him could not sign his name and so was not worth the hearing. I did not know. Silas Pruitt broke next, and he broke by trying to speak and finding he could not meet his lady's eye. He had hired them. He had brought the 800 guineas and the iron piles and the ruin into the house to look modern before her. He had built the story of sabotage to save himself, and here it lay on the floor in 300-year-old ink. He got out 2 words, my lady, and Marianne looked at him once. Only once, and he stopped, and looked at the floor, and stayed looking at it, and that was Pruitt's whole reckoning, and it was enough. And the Lincoln surveyor, the bank's dry man, who had come to condemn, put his rule back in his pocket, and folded his condemning paper in half, and in half again, and said to no one that he did not believe he would be troubling her ladyship this Michaelmas after all. But it was Ned who was not looking at any of them. The boy had slipped away in the first moment of the breaking, back down the cellar stair with a lamp, down to the black brimming water of the subcrypt where the raft rode true again in its bed. He had rolled his sleeve to the shoulder. He was on his knees on the wet stone, with his whole arm in the freezing flood to the armpit, feeling in the churned mud for the one thing that mattered more to him than any deed. And his cold fingers closed on brass. He came back up into the ballroom, dripping and blue with cold, and holding it high, his grandfather's plumb-bob, streaming water, the mark upon it turned to the light, and Sir Denholm Ashe took it from the boy's frozen hand and wiped it on his own coat, and carried it to the deed still open on the floor, and held the brass mark down beside the mark inked 300 years before at the bottom of the indenture. They were the same. Anyone in the room could see they were the same. 2 crossed tools within a circle, and the letter C, the hand that signed the deed, and the hand that cut the plumb-bob, and the hand that cut the deepest stone under the whole weight of the house, one hand, come down 10 generations to the muddy old man they had thrown off the terrace. "There is your proof, my lady," said Sir Denholm quietly, "in brass and stone and ink." All 3 agree. It was full morning before the party climbed at last out of the reeking cellars into the light, and it was on the terrace that Amos Crake was asked, by Marianne herself, in a voice gone humble, the question the whole of it had been building to. "How did you know?" she said. "How did you know to do it, when the cleverest men in England did not?" And Amos, standing where he had been mocked before 40 gentlefolk, and had his tools thrown in the mud, standing where the London engineer had said the man cannot sign his own name, Amos looked at her, and then out over the flat, wet, shining fen his fathers had built upon, and he gave her the whole of 300 years in a single quiet breath. "You drained her to keep her dry," he said. "My people kept her wet to keep her standing. 300 years we've fed this house her water, my lady. That's all it ever was. You can't read that in a book, because we never wrote it down. We just kept it. No one laughed this time." The undoing came quickly after, as such things do once the truth has the floor. Sir Denholm Ashe set his finding down in writing, in the clear certain hand of a man no bank in England would gainsay, that Fenmoor Hall stood sound upon a medieval floating foundation of rare and admirable craft, that her recent sinking was caused wholly by the drainage works of Messrs. Vance and Harlow, and that the said works had been arrested, and the fault repaired, by the hereditary keeper of the foundation, one Amos Crake, according to a method 3 centuries old and preserved in his family alone. The Cawood and Sedgebank's surveyor withdrew his condemnation before the ink was dry. The mortgage held, the house was sound, Lady Marianne Fenmoor slept that night, for the first time in 3 years, in a home that was truly hers and truly standing, and the firm of Vance and Harlow, of Great George Street, Westminster, was ordered to return its 800 guineas in full, and its report upon Fenmoor Hall was struck out and its recommendations reversed, and Julian Vance went back to London on the slow afternoon train with his fashionable calm in ruins, having been proved wrong, before the bank and the gentry and a boy of 16, by an old man who could not write his name. Some weeks on, when the plaster was mended and the ballroom whole, Lady Marianne did a thing with her own hands. She had the deepest keystone of the great hall uncovered where the plaster had hidden it, and the Crake mark upon it cleaned and gilded, so that it caught the light. And beside it, on a bracket of oak, she hung the brass plumb-bob, dried and polished, its own worn mark turned outward to match the gold one in the stone. She hung it herself, standing on the mason's own trestle, and would let no servant do it for her. "So that it is written after all," she said when it was up, "where it can be read." The seasons went over Fenmoor Hall, as seasons do. The spring floods came up over the fen and lapped at the old leats and drew off again, and the hall stood true through every one of them at the level the Crakes kept, drinking her water, riding her 300-year raft, sound to her ancient heart. Amos lived to see 3 more springs come and go, keeping the water as he had kept it 50 years, and when at last he was laid in Marish churchyard, it was Ned who stood keeper in his place. Ned Crake, grown now, the deed's plain letters by heart and the brass plumb-bob at his own belt, taught to tap the stone and listen to the water as his grandfather had taught him in the drowned dark. Of the others the fen keeps shorter tales. The firm of Vance and Harlow was heard of for some years yet in the great works of the age, but it is a curious thing. Julian Vance never once, in any paper he read before any learned society to the end of his days, made mention of Fenmoor Hall, nor of floating foundations, nor of the old method of the fen. Some knowledge a man buries, and Silas Pruitt stayed on as steward, humbled and the better for it, and it is told that years after, meeting old Amos at the churchyard wall, the steward asked him at last, plainly, man to man, how he would have done it, had they only listened at the start. And Amos told him the whole of it, freely, the leets and the oak and the charcoal and the clay, keeping back nothing. For the secret had never been a spite. It had only been a thing no one had thought to ask a man who could not write. For that is the whole of it, and the Fen has told it 300 years and will tell it 300 more. The cleverest men in England came up from London with their drawings and their 800 guineas, and they failed to save the sinking Manor, and an old mason they mocked, who could not sign his name, knew the secret and kept it and saved her, because some things cannot be written down. They can only be kept and passed from an old hand to a young one, in the dark, over water. Wherever you are watching from tonight, comment your town below. I should dearly like to see how far this old story of the Fen has travelled.